All right, everyone. I'm so grateful to get started. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of our DFAS director, Miss Audrey Davis, and the director of Office of Equal Opportunity Programs, Mr. Will Bryson, I would like to welcome you all to our 2023 Pride Month observance event. I would also like to acknowledge our DFAS leadership that are attending, as well as other distinguished guests. DFAS employees and members of the armed forces. My name is Andreas McGee, the DFAS Indianapolis site advisor. With a heavy heart, I have to announce that our previous guest speaker, Miss Shelley Snyder, who is the executive director with Indy Bride Incorporated, had a loss in her family and will not be able to attend. And we extend a heartfelt condolences to her and her family. At this time, we are deeply honored and grateful for our new guest speaker, Mr. Nathaniel Bamey, who graciously agreed to be our guest speaker in very short notice. A little bit about our guest speaker. Mr. Nathaniel Bamey has extensive experience working with veterans and service members and their families in crisis since 2012. He has managed and developed programs and provided direct services to veterans and their families in Portland, Seattle, and most recently Los Angeles. For 5 years, he has served as the nation's first and only LGBTQ plus veterans coordinator in Oregon. Currently, he now continues his service in civil rights with the United States Department of Agriculture Forest Service. Nathaniel works to consistently engage in anti-racist and equity-minded work. I'm proud to announce he's also a proud member of the Armed Forces, and I will let him provide you with greater detail on his service to our nation. So without further ado, I will turn this presentation over to our guest speaker, Mr. Nathaniel Bamey.
It's quite the intro. Thank you. Thank you so much. And no worries at all ever on the delay. I think making sure that we have accessibility is one of the most important things we can do, both as civil rights practitioners and as human beings, truthfully. I've heard it described that it's not so much the disability in the person, but more so the inability for our technology to accommodate folks. So very happy that we're able to have those folks on. All right, so that was a rather, I like the intro, and thank you so much for having me here. Will Bryson was my director at the USDA Forest Service, and I will tell you that our loss is your gain. So thanks, Will, for having me, and again, happy Pride to everybody. So before I step too much into this, I want to make sure that we take a moment to engage in a land acknowledgement. And you may be asking yourself, what exactly is a land acknowledgement? So the Smithsonian describes a land acknowledgement as a traditional custom that dates back centuries in many Native nations and communities. Today, land acknowledgements are used by Native peoples and non-Natives to recognize Indigenous peoples who are the original stewards of the land on which we now live. Now, I want a quick recognition of some of the terminology there, original stewards. We'll come back to that very shortly here. But I personally do land acknowledgements as a white identified individual because racism can show up through invisibility of Indigenous lands, erasure of Indigenous history, and ongoing oppression of current day Indigenous people. For me, I sit geographically in Portland, Oregon, and Portland rests on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. And when you do land acknowledgements, a couple of things to keep in mind. Start with self-reflection. Ask yourself, why are you doing a land acknowledgement and what your end goal is? Does this help Indigenous peoples? And have you personally pledged any financial or other support to Native-led organizations? Really do your research as well. Use Indigenous place names and learn the correct pronunciation. Be specific with the Native American nation that you're recognizing, and I can share with you a link on which you can search for these as well. Remember to speak the truth. Acknowledgement should include words like genocide, stolen land, and forced removal. Michael Lambert, Associate Professor of African Studies and Anthropology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, says statements often refer to Indigenous people as original stewards or custodians of land that is now occupied by another entity. Remember, we talked about that earlier up front. To him, that language obscures the fact that tribal nations were sovereign over those lands and they weren't just caretakers. Some land acknowledgements also fail to acknowledge the traumas that accompany Native people being removed from their lands. That process of transferring control from the Indians to non-Indians was fraught with conflict. It was violent, it involved murder, and in some cases, extreme pain, he says. Make sure also to include present and future tenses. Native people are still here and contributing to making the world a better place. And really make sure to emphasize hope and positivity. Despite the many atrocities committed, Native communities remain committed to leaving the world better than they found it. And honestly, please try not to ask an Indigenous person to deliver a welcome statement or read the land acknowledgement. Indigenous people may already bear enough of the burden of colonization. And focus on action. Acknowledgement without action does not address systematic racism facing Indigenous peoples. And because this is also Juneteenth and Pride Month, I want to talk about intersections of Indigenous peoples as well as the LGBTQI+ community and the Black or African American community. So many of you may be familiar with the concept of Two-Spirit. So the term or identity of Two-Spirit does not make sense unless it's contextualized within a Native American frame. Two-Spirit within the traditional setting was a gender analysis and not a sexual orientation. Today, most people associate the term with LGBTQ natives. However, the work of the Two-Spirit organizations is more akin with the traditional understanding. Some roles of Two-Spirit included mediators, social workers, name-giving, love potion, matchmaker, Sundance, holy people, and they told the future and brought good luck. They were peacemakers for the tribe, and they joined war parties. They were doctors and medicine people. Indian life for the Two-Spirit during the reservation system had a system where European and Native beliefs often clashed. Missionaries fed the Two-Spirit people to the dogs. Christian beliefs were forced upon Native people, and Native children were placed in government schools, as you may be well aware. So today, out of love and respect, oftentimes Two-Spirit were asked to go underground to protect them. Turning to a celebration of Juneteenth during Pride Month as well, or a celebration of Pride Month during Juneteenth or Freedom Day as well. Since we also celebrate Juneteenth, I want to make sure to add a labor acknowledgement. A labor acknowledgement is a statement that recognizes much of the economic progress and development in a geographic area or industry resulted from the unpaid labor and forced servitude of people of color, specifically enslaved African labor. Additionally, we wish to acknowledge the stolen lands of Black Americans. At the beginning of the 20th century, African Americans owned at least 14 million acres of land. By the 21st century, 90% of that land had been stolen from them. Now, African Americans only own 1.1 million acres of farmland and are part owners of another 1.7 million acres. Across a century, white farmers and landowners developed a multitude of ways to take African Americans' land, including methods such as heirs property, tax sales, and Torrens Acts. Additionally, again, because we talk about the intersections between the Black and African American community and Pride, I want to make sure we highlight a few members of that community. From the 1960s, civil rights activist Bayard Rustin to Chicago's first lesbian mayor, Lori Lightfoot, Black LGBTQ Americans have long made history with innumerable contributions to politics, art, medicine, and a host of other fields. Quote, as long as there have been Black people, there have been Black LGBTQ and same gender loving people, said David Johns, Executive Director of the National Black Justice Coalition. Racism combined with the forces of stigma, phobia, discrimination, and bias associated with gender and sexuality have too often erased the contributions of members of our community. Some of those include Audre Lorde, a self-described Black lesbian feminist, mother, poet, and warrior, who coined the term intersectionality, as well as Marsha P. Johnson, who would cheekily tell people that the P stood for pay it no mind. She was an outspoken transgender rights activist and is reported to be one of the central figures of the historic Stonewall Uprising in 1969 that we'll talk about a little bit later. So I want to take a moment to talk about myself, not too long though. I don't like talking about myself too much and I want to step into some better content, but you see there, we are proud fur parents. We have two little ones, Muppet, the brown one, and Andy, the black one. My spouse and I have been together for 8.5 years, and I come from a very large family, actually. I'm the youngest of 6 kids. We grew up Mormon, and they're in rural Wyoming. So a heck of a path my life has taken, but very happy for my beginnings and that strong family background. I do want to talk a little bit about my military history as well. So as I mentioned, or as had been mentioned initially, I'm third generation Air Force, and I've served in various components. My dad served for over 38 years in the Air Force, and my mom's dad was one of the last warrant officers to be commissioned in the Air Force at the end of World War II before they discontinued that program in the Air Force. On September 1st, I recall being out processing the base for Hill Air Force Base to go to boot camp, but they sent us home, of course, because of the 9/11 attacks. And in this September, I will have been in 23 years. Also, I did want to say to our interpreters, I know I can speak fast sometimes, so if I'm speaking a little too fast, please let me know. um, During my time in the military, I've been deployed on a number of occasions, both in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom. I was deployed to Ramstein Air Base in Germany, where I served as Security Forces member, the same job I did at Hill Air Force Base, Utah, and Dover Air Force Base, Delaware. I was also deployed to Iraq in 2005-2006 during Saddam Hussein's trial. More recently, I was deployed to Savannah, Georgia during the beginning of the pandemic in support of presidential security. As you may know, the Army and Air National Guard have a primary mission to their states in times of crises like the pandemic. And I was activated a while back to help the COVID-19 vaccine efforts here in Portland, and last year was activated to provide hospital support in Oregon with the overwhelming crises we were facing. But one of my most rewarding military experiences was being promoted to Staff Sergeant NCO while deployed in Iraq. Taking the NCO oath in a deployed location added some incredible poignance to that experience. I've held a few different AFSCs, or Air Force Specialty Codes, in the 20 plus years I've served. I was a mechanic on gas and diesel generators and for most of my career, I was ammo or munitions, where I worked to inspect, store, assemble, and deliver all non-nuclear munitions from bullets, bombs, all the way up to the bunker busters that we use. However, what I feel has been my most important job is the one that I have now in EO, or Equal Opportunity. In this job, I work directly for the commander to ensure a workplace that's free from discrimination and bigotry. I've always believed that we can have the world's most advanced weapon systems sitting on the flight line, but if people feel like they can't show up for work and be their true authentic selves because of their race, sex, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, or any other, then that billion weapons dollar system will sit there and rot. When people are affirmed in who they are, then we are better able to meet the nation's needs and security. I also have the distinct honor of being the very first person in Portland and also Seattle to be approved by their command to wear a uniform while in the Pride Parade. And that was a pretty cool experience for me. My civilian career encompasses quite a bit, as had been mentioned, and I really truly believe that to engage in this kind of work, you really have to have a sense of compassion and a sense of empathy for the people you work with. I always knew that I would be in some sort of a career that had a service component to it, whether it was military, whether it was social services, or whether it's now doing the work that I do with the USDA Forest Service and civil rights. I do want to make sure that I put the caveat here. This is on my personal time. Anything that is said here reflects my personal opinions and does not necessarily reflect the opinions of the USDA Forest Service or the US Air Force or any of the other professional organizations that I am affiliated with. Just want to make sure I put that caveat there. Honestly, and I believe that really to be a full member of a community, you have to engage at all levels to ensure that equity and access to services, resources, and goods that the community may bestow. And because of that, I've been a volunteer in a lot of these organizations as well. All right, so enough about me. I've been talking a lot, and I'm going to go ahead and actually turn off my camera so we can focus on the content, and so our interpreters have an unobscured view of things, or you all have an unobscured view of our interpreters. So what is Pride? Why do we celebrate Pride? And a question that I always like to ask my audiences is how long have LGBTQI plus people served in the military? Well, I think you all know that the answer is as long as the military has existed. And this conversation is going to have that unique flair of intersectionality with the LGBTQI plus community and military service, both because of who I am and the work that I've done, but also because of this organization, DFAS. I will tell you that I am extremely thankful for the services that you all provide us, because without a paycheck, we couldn't definitely do the work that we do. So thank you all for your service as well. A little bit of history about the LGBTQI plus community. So in the mid 1800s, one of the very first organization was started by Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a German physician and sexologist educated primarily in Germany. And he was an outspoken advocate for these sexual minorities, and he founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, the world's first gay rights organization. Stepping forward into the 1950s, the Mattachine Society is one of the earliest LGBTQI plus organizations in the US, and communist and labor activist Harry Hay formed the group to protect and improve the rights of gay men. 1955 saw the organization of the Daughters of Bilitis, or DOB, or Daughters, the first lesbian civil and political rights organization in the US, and it was conceived as a social alternative to lesbian bars, which were the subject of raids and police harassment, which brought us to 1969, the Stonewall Uprising. How did it all start? Pride Month started as a riot against police brutality at a small dive bar in New York City called the Stonewall Inn. At that time, there existed outdated, quote, masquerade or cross-dressing laws that suggested a man or woman must be wearing a certain number of clothing items that matched the gender on their state-issued ID. The police took advantage of these laws to raid drinking establishments and arrest transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. Just after midnight on June 28, 1969, the police raided the Stonewall Inn like they had many times before. Only this time, something unusual happened. Stonewall patrons fought back. So I want you to take a moment and think about some of the things that are happening contemporarily in our nation right now. When we talk about outdated masquerade or cross-dressing laws that suggest that a man or woman must be wearing a certain number of clothing items that match the gender on their state-issued ID, something very important to think about when, again, we look at the current culture in which we exist. So what does Pride Month mean to you personally? For me, I love Pride Month. My very first Pride celebration was in the area where I grew up, Salt Lake City. I was young, barely out of the closet. I remember feeling euphoric and overwhelmed by the sense of community, that celebration of a public queer life, and a general sense of camaraderie with others. Celebrating, whether privately with friends or in our own ways, or out in the streets marching in parades, is an opportunity to remember the work our queer ancestors to whom we are indebted, and an opportunity to harness the celebratory energy Pride creates to get back to the work of that fight that remains before us. So what is the importance of safe, or as you may hear, brave spaces? Not too many years ago, a horrendous and vile attack was perpetrated against my community at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. We lost 49 of our loved ones to senseless hatred. Never before have I realized the tremendous importance of spaces like Pulse and other gay or queer bars to me personally and to my community as a whole. There are few, if any, public spaces where I feel comfortable holding hands or expressing affection to my spouse, and society has gone a long way to prove to me how dangerous it can be to do that. Even more, though, as a gay combat veteran and currently serving in the military, I have to reflect on what those spaces mean, and even more what that loss means. For 9 years, while serving in the military under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, there were very few spaces as years of blood, sweat, and tears could have been wiped away. But when I walk into a space or a place where I can exist without fear of being punished for merely existing, this speaks volumes. And it also speaks volumes to my privilege as a cisgender white man, that there are many spaces that I can choose to avoid discrimination, an option often not available to my trans, Black, and brown family. Today, I want to express my sincere gratitude to all those warriors who came before me to help create spaces like Pulse. I want to honor those lives that were lost simply for existing. I also want to rededicate and encourage you all to rededicate yourself to the fight for all of us. I will be your accomplice. I will stand by your side. I will see you, hear you, and love you as you do for me. Looking contemporarily, we only still have 20 states that ban conversion therapy. And as recently as 3 years ago, 2 states had bans on protection orders for same-sex interpersonal violence survivors. In some places, it is still legal to discriminate against LGBTQ plus people for housing in public spaces. There are also states that still allow things like the gay panic defense or the trans panic defense, and more than 30 states still have HIV-specific criminal law or broader criminal law perceived or potential exposure or transmission of HIV. Again, an archaic and outdated outlook on things. Something that I suggest when you step into your spaces or you step into your conversations or meetings, having suggested community agreements. So really committing to examining your own privilege and biases. Acknowledge them if you feel comfortable acknowledging your own privileges. Lean into discomfort and acknowledge that the difference between discomfort and safety matters to people. Understand that respect is a complex and dynamic thing, and it means different things to different people. Understand that people's feelings and experiences are their facts, and they may look different from larger social patterns. We are experts in our own experiences. And trust your intent, but also explore your impact. Understand that there are truths in our identity and reflect on your own participation. Look at positionality and learn to take space and make space when needed. So I'm not going to spend too much time, but I did want to make sure that we included a quick conversation of some terminology that many of you, hopefully all of you are familiar with, but just wanted to make sure we do take a quick cultural responsiveness understanding about the LGBTQI plus communities. So a lot of you may be familiar with this amazing graphic here, the gender unicorn, and that can be found at the Trans Student Education Resource, I believe is the TSER acronym. So just a quick thing, a couple of quick things here to remember. You see that all of these things, gender identity, expression, physically attracted to, emotionally attracted to, these are all continuums, meaning there's not 1, 2, 3, 4, even 5 specific answers to it, but it really depends on that person. You'll notice something in the conversation that we have here that I am very person focused. As a social worker and somebody working in civil rights, I think it's very important to be person focused because they are our customers. They are the ones that we need to make sure are bringing us their expertise and we are listening to them. So what is sex? The idea of sex may refer to biological constructs, referring to either genetic, hormonal, anatomical, or physiological characteristics on whose basis one is labeled at birth, either as male or female. Now, some of you may know the medical science behind it, but it's a rather archaic science on how doctors will determine at birth whether a baby is male or female. Gender is cultural meanings and patterns of behavior and experience and personality that are labeled as masculine or feminine. So myself, I introduce myself as cisgender. That is a term for somebody who has a gender identity that is congruent with that assigned at birth. So when we talk about sex defined anatomically, what about people who have both genitalia, neither genitalia, or ambiguous genitalia? Something important to think about. Chromosomally, there are many different variations on the XX and XY, Klinefelters, etc. And some say there should honestly be about 6 recognized sexes. Gender is this idea of how we stand, talk, and interact with others, and it's really informed by our own perception of other people's genders. That's one of the very first things we try to establish when we meet somebody, because there's so many cultural prescriptions for how we interact based upon our perception of their gender. Also, not knowing somebody's gender might make us uncomfortable because we don't know that script to rely upon while interacting with that person. Some of you may remember the skit from SNL, It's Pat, this person who was ambiguously gendered, and the funny joke about it was that they kept trying to figure out whether this person was going to use the men's room or the women's room, but it really highlights that discomfort that we have not knowing somebody's gender, because again, we are taught to interact with people differently based upon our perception of their gender and our own gender. That idea of gender identity is a person's basic sense of being a man or a boy, a woman or a girl, or another gender. For example, transgender, bigender, genderqueer, or even a rejection of the traditional binary classification of gender. Gender expression is that manifestation of characteristics in one's personality, appearance, behavior that are culturally defined as feminine or masculine. Gender dysphoria is the idea of discomfort with one's sex assigned at birth, and transgender is the widely used term to refer to an incredibly diverse group of individuals who transcend culturally defined gender norms. So when we talk about, we are missing a slide here. Oh, we are. There we go. I clicked too far. Hang on. It's coming, I promise. Oh, technology. To err is human. To really mess something up takes a computer. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about our LGBTQI plus military and veteran community. There is supposed to be a little graphic in the middle that says that, but I'm sure you can determine from the pictures that's what we're talking about. So there are currently more than 75,000 LGB people serving actively today. Now, remember, we are talking specifically about lesbian, gay, bisexual folks because of the recent back and forth regarding open and authentic trans service. This represents more than 5% of all actively serving. By contrast, 3% of Americans openly identify as LGB. So what does that tell you? LGBTQI plus people are more likely to serve in the military than the general population. More than 1 million LGB veterans have served, and an estimated 14.5 thousand individuals were discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and approximately 1,000 individuals have sought an upgrade, only 8%. More than 15,000 trans persons are actively serving, again, representing about 1% of actively serving military, whereas by reference, only about 0.6 of Americans openly identify as trans, and more than 134,000 trans veterans have served. Again, highlighting the fact that the LGBTQI plus community is more likely to serve in the military than is the general population. During the time of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and prior to, the military kicked out a number of individuals based solely on the perception that they were gay. Separation codes on the DD-214, as you may be familiar, had specific ones associated with what they termed homosexuality. 21 codes contained the term homosexuality, in fact. Only 12 had the word drug in them, drug use, abuse, or drug program failure, and only 4 contained the word alcohol, alcoholism, alcohol abuse, etc. Those members who were kicked out of the military, again, based solely on the perception that they were gay, meant that the military had to spend an estimated $22,000 to $43,000 per person to replace those discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Estimated costs of Don't Ask, Don't Tell implementation range between $290 to $500 million. Now that Don't Ask, Don't Tell has been repealed in 2011, what is now protected? Sexual orientation remains a personal and private matter. Sexual orientation is not a bar to entry or continued service, and service members will not be subjected to administrative separation for homosexual, bisexual acts, statements, or same-sex marriages. However, that repeal in 2011 did not provide any gender identity protections, and transgender service members were still unable to serve openly and authentically. Also, something to keep in mind, that 2011 repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell did nothing for the Defense of Marriage Act. So for about 4 or 5 years, there were same-sex married partners in the military who were unable to receive the same benefits that mixed-sex couples were. So a quick history of transgender service. As you may be aware and may remember, in 2016 was the first time in our nation's history that trans people were allowed to serve openly and authentically. And then, of course, in 2017, we remember the tweet heard around the world, and it wasn't until 2019 that that was implemented and trans people weren't allowed to serve, join, but those who are already in were allowed to continue serving. However, one of the first actions that President Biden did was to allow full and authentic service members for all of the LGBTQI plus community, to include trans folks, and provided a means for legal transitioning. DODI, or DOD Instruction 1300.28, titled In-Service Transition for Transgender Service Members, provided that guidance. It established protocol for gender transition during military service. It describes prerequisites as well as procedures for changing a service member's gender marker in DEERS, and it provides specific transition-related medical treatment for active duty and reserve members. So when we talk about health outcomes for the LGBTQI plus veteran community, those are very, very different for the general population as well. And something to keep in mind, I know that a lot of times this conversation is tilted towards service providers, but also for you all working in DFAS as individuals who will interact with veterans and retirees and military members, something else to keep in mind when we have this cultural responsiveness. So as we know, veterans in the LGBTQI plus community are at a much higher risk for suicide. In fact, in Oregon, 27% of suicides are veterans. and LGBT veterans are 15% more likely to attempt suicide. In 2016, a DoD report on sexual assault estimated that 3.5% of LGBT men had been assaulted compared to 0.3% of non-LGBT men, and an estimated 6.3% of LGBT women having reported assaults compared to 3.5% of non-LGBT women. Considering mental health, the rate of suicide events in fiscal year 2010 that veterans were 20 times higher to have suicide-related events as opposed to those who did not have gender dysphoria diagnoses. The average rate of suicide is much lower for cisgender veterans, and transgender veterans face things like employment discrimination, and also very few currently access the VA healthcare because of things that the VA is unable at this time to provide care, and also discrimination. So given that I say we as you as well, are a federal entity, I'd like to talk really quickly about LGBTQI plus service in the federal government. In the 1950s, there was a report titled Employment of Homosexuals and Other Sex Perverts in the Government that stated, overt acts of sex perversion, including acts of homosexuality, constitute a crime under our federal, state, and municipal statutes, and persons who commit such acts are law violators. This led also to the Lavender Scare after World War II, where LGBTQI plus people were viewed as a liability and a source of communist-inducing blackmail. Untold thousands of LGBTQI plus employees in the federal government, along with their gender nonconforming counterparts, were systematically rooted out and expelled at all levels of government. So I talked really briefly about the Defense of Marriage Act. So remember, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed in 2011, but it wasn't until 2013 and then 2015 that the Supreme Court finally struck down the Defense of Marriage Act. And that Supreme Court decision, U.S. versus Windsor, affirmed that all same-sex couples would be given the same legal respect and treatment as their heterosexual counterparts. So what changed was spouse and marriage were construed without regard to sexual orientation or gender identity, and same-sex spouses were afforded the same benefits as their heterosexual counterparts. I will tell you that some of those vestiges of DOMA did remain. It was only a few years ago that I was updating my VRED, the Virtual Record of Emergency Data for the military, and I went to put my spouse as my emergency contact in the VRED, and a box popped up alerting me that said, note, according to the Federal Government Defense of Marriage Act, a spouse can only be somebody of the opposite sex. Now, mind you, this was a good 4 years after DOMA had been repealed, but it was still there in that system. I went to my commander, who's actually our wing commander now, and I said, sir, I cannot fill out this VRED because I would be lying. And he looked at me and said, Sergeant Bamey, it's just cobwebs in the system. And I looked at him and I said, respectfully, Colonel, cobwebs in a system have never invalidated your marriage in an official military system. And he paused and he looked at me and said, you're right. We eventually got it sorted out, but something to keep in mind that these things still exist sometimes, and these microaggressions can really, really add up. And what does it mean when we have representation? How do we conversely step back from that and work to move forward? So when we talk about representation, when we talk about the default, these are the cultural considerations for what kind of person fills a specific role or an institution. So when we say something about doctor or an institution of marriage or veteran, we have to put qualifiers in front of them if that person doesn't fit the archetype of what we think. So I'll give you an example: doctor versus woman doctor, veteran versus LGBTQ veteran, or a person telling a story and saying a Black man versus a person. I ask that person, is it your perception that that individual's race or your perception of that race is important to this story? I'll give you another quick story that had happened to me. I was at Pride in 2019 working as the LGBTQ Veterans Coordinator for the state of Oregon. And I had a veteran come up to me, seemed very nice, and wanted to have a conversation, sparkles in his beard. I think he'd had a few drinks. His wife was with him. And he started talking to me and he said, you know what? As a combat veteran, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who you love. It doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter any of those things as long as you got my back. And I looked at him and I said, respectfully, sir, as a queer combat veteran, it does matter because your wife and you have never walked down the street worried that somebody would beat the living hell out of you based on your mere existence. You have never worried that you would get kicked out of the military because you're straight, that somebody would look differently at you because you're straight, that you would be denied medical care or the ability to see your dying spouse because you're straight. It does matter. And he looked at me and he said, you're right. He ended up giving me a big hug and it was a kumbaya after that. But something that's important to remember is representation is critical. When more LGBTQ or people of color are included in the media in positive ways, this means that they're actually being seen by society as opposed to being rendered unseen or invisible. I think I talked about this a little bit earlier with the land acknowledgement. When people see positive representations of themselves in the media, this can also foster a great sense of affirmation of their identity. Positive media representation can be helpful in increasing self-esteem for people of marginalized groups, especially youth. And interpersonal contact and exposure through media representation can assist in reducing stereotypes of underrepresented groups. It can help people realize they're not alone. Representation also helps foster understanding and tolerance, and it shapes how people think about their identity. So how can we, both as civil rights practitioners, as employees of a federal agency, or individuals, help improve our workplace for LGBTQI plus people and others? So again, remembering representation. Representation matters. Ensure that anyone who may seek your services or do business with you will able to see somebody that looks like them. Make sure that there are Black, Indigenous people of color or BIPOC people represented, LGBTQI plus people, women, etc. in workplace pictures, in ads, and in the workplace itself. There's also multiple trainings that exist and safe zone trainings to show allyship with the LGBTQI plus community. Also think about trauma-informed care approach. This is an approach based on knowledge that the impact of trauma is aimed and also ensuring environments and services are welcome and engaging for service recipients and staff. And what does trauma-informed care means? It means that you interact with somebody with the understanding that they may have experienced trauma at some point in their life and that may be impacting them, that they do not spontaneously exist in that moment that you interact with them, and to be cognizant of them. Something that I like to keep in mind when I'm interacting with somebody and I get a little frustrated is I have no idea what happened to this person yesterday. Their spouse could have died and they had to come to work or else they'd lose their house. And so providing that bit of grace, that bit of empathy, that bit of compassion, even if you don't know, is so important. And remembering to be person-centered, recognizing difference and celebrate individualism, but most importantly, listen, 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 listen. Don't think of yourself as a gatekeeper. And it's really important to examine your own possible biases around LGBTQ plus people, and especially trans people. Making sure that you're aware of the local, state, and federal laws, and remembering, of course, the EEOC has ruled that sexual orientation and gender identity and expression are protected from discrimination under the sex category. Discard any assumptions you may have based on archaic cultural relics, and listen to your language. Try to stay away from things like ma'am or sir until you've established their desire for these terms. Again, person-centered. Saying spouse. If they say spouse, don't assume it's somebody of the opposite sex. And one thing that gets us quite a bit here in the Oregon and Pacific Northwest is a lot of people say guys. I know that they'll tell you that they mean it in a gender-neutral way, but you ask any straight man how many guys they've kissed, and all of a sudden it becomes gendered to them. So something to keep in mind. All right, folks. That is all I have. I know this was kind of quick. I see that there's a lot of comments and a lot of questions. I think we have 10 minutes left. I, of course, want to be respectful of your time, but I would love to have any questions or comments or anything that you all might have. Yes, I do speak very quickly. Thank you, Joy. And thank you to the interpreters for keeping up. I really, really appreciate it. I don't know, do we have the ability for folks to come on camera or how does this work? I know we have oh goodness, 509. No pressure, Nathaniel.
Yes. Hey, Nathaniel, I'm just running through our chat to see questions that were posted.
And you all are also welcome to reach out at any of these here. I may not have the answer, but I'd like to think that I'm somewhat connected. So I'm happy to provide any of that if you might like. So I do see a specific question. How do you learn about land acknowledgements in your area? I'm not exactly sure what that question is asking, but what I will say is maybe take it upon yourself to engage in that land acknowledgement. When you facilitate a meeting, when you have a group or something, try to start out with that land acknowledgement. And there are multiple different tools you can use. There's a GIS tool that you can use that actually shows the native tribes that existed on your land as well, that you can use to engage in that and really reflect on the reason why you're doing that. I saw what's a good gender neutral term instead of guys? Y'all, folks. You'll notice I say folks quite a bit. And I like it. It's not to be repetitive or redundant in its, there you go, folks, not to be repetitive or redundant, but it's a very folksy term. I love having a new audience for my dad jokes. Did I miss any other questions or am I still active duty Red Reserve? So I'm in the Air National Guard, currently serving with the 142nd Wing here in Portland. I would say that it's typically the, two days a month, 15 days a year, but definitely not how the EO program works. I have learned that in the military, EO does the same job that 5 or 6 different people do in the federal government. So it's never ending. You'll notice I even have my military computer there and probably jump onto it after a moment. Where do you get the map for land acknowledgement? Honestly, if you just do a Google search for land acknowledgement map, there are a host of different good sources. I think I did have that GIS link and I'm not sure where it went though. See if I can find that for you. Okay, yeah, there's a host of different ones. I'll throw one in here from Duke University, it looks like.
So Nathaniel, one question that have come is, how do you get trauma-informed and dignity training? How do you do it right? I can and am a proud ally. I have one for you. Do you have any suggestions for alternatives to ma'am, sir that demonstrate respect to our leaders in a military environment? Okay. What is a good gender neutral term to use instead of, oh, you answered that one, guys. You answered that one.
Uh, I'm just trying to get unmuted. Can you hear me? There's a little bit of lag, I think, in my audio, so I apologize for interrupting you there. But it's great to see you, and given my lag on the audio, I think if I turned on my video, my computer might just explode. So I'm just going to wrap this up. If there are questions in the, I see a ton of questions in the general chat, and if for time purposes,
Thank you, Nathaniel.
Yes, I want to thank all those who, provided support. Special thanks to Mr. Will Bryson, to, Miss Cynthia Icebones, Kathy Lukey, Michelle Lugo, Bonette, Belinda Kish, and a special thank you to our interpreters who hung in there and really provided great, fantastic service. And again, special thanks to our IT collaboration team, Joy Jackson Green, Corey Kanicki, Garrett Stratton, and Takesha Tack, and our OEOP leadership. We want to say a special thank you to DFAS leadership and other support personnel. Please attend our next program, which is the Juneteenth observance. It'll be Tuesday, June 20th from 11 to noon. Our guest speaker will be Jimmy McMillan, who proudly serves as a senior corporate counsel with the Chief Diversity Officer for Penske Entertainment. Also, please fill out the poll questions so you can earn your 1 CET for the training. Additionally, please visit our Celebrate Diversity and Inclusion portal page for more cultural observance information. And I want to thank you all for attending and continue to have a great DFAS day.
Well, this is